I'm running as fast as I can. This subalpine plain between Forester Pass and Tyndall Creek is covered in black clouds, a rock path, and very few trees. Lightning hits a second or so away. I'm headed briskly towards lodgepole pines, standing starkly in contrast to the horizontal lines of yellow grass and gray. I've been closing in on it for about 15 minutes, and it's been 2.5 days since Lake Marjorie, but the storms have stayed with me since. So I'm still running as fast as I can. This is an excerpt from one of my trail journals when I hiked the John Muir Trail over 14 days from Yosemite to Mount Whitney. I was asked recently if I could do an episode that was a little bit more about my own experiences in nature and not so much about the science or the history behind why and how we experience things in modern life. Just a true account of my personal experience. So we're going to try that today. My name is Christopher Grant Ward, and this is Rebel Nature. I'm an award-winning artist and naturalist obsessed with the ways nature can rewire our brains and change our perception of everyday things. I'm so happy you're listening. So if you've been listening along to Rebel Nature this year, you'll know that a journal entry is actually quite a departure from the normal episodes that we've been having. But the original idea was actually just to talk about these journal entries in my artist journal. So I'm excited to try this because I feel like it actually gives you a direct insight into the ways I see nature as I'm experiencing it. We'll start on August 6th, the day I left. My time on the John Muir Trail can be split into 2 parts. The first few days amounted to getting settled, learning how to camp for the first time ever, getting more fit, working out the required food per day, and my knee issues, and how to sleep in a bivy sack. We'll get into that in a moment. All the while, I've been hiking 15 to 20 miles a day on blisters and a sore ankle, all of which would go numb after the first mile and stay that way as long as I kept walking. I met some great people and I had some wonderful mid-hike conversations about Burma, the importance of asymmetrical career paths, why foreign languages are great undergrad majors, why and how the Sierras are and aren't geologically interesting, and all about libertarians and the ways they vote, the trials and tribulations of ultralight backpacking, and anadromous fish, bear behavior, and what have you. I actually think that the relationships and the new friendships I make on these long-distance hikes are some of the most interesting parts of the journey. These people, just like me, who have decided either by themselves or with a friend to go out into the wilderness for a number of weeks to rediscover something, and we all share that longing to find what's been missing. I camped with some or all of these fellow trail friends at the end of each night. And every morning we would each break camp and head out at our own pace. It's sort of a staggered ruck march, capped usually by a mid-morning peak of some 13,000 feet. However, we always intersected and connected with each other at regular intervals throughout the day. And there's so much more to tell here about myself and the start of the trail, and I promise I will. But on around the 9th day, I began quite a different journey. As I had every night prior, I went to sleep, planning to sleep in, to take it easy, to be nice to myself. This was a rule for the trip that was inevitably broken each morning after not being able to get any sleep inside my bivvy. And if you aren't familiar, a bivvy is a lightweight shelter that sounds like a good idea in theory. In reality, Bivy is a fancy body bag with an optional mosquito net and a logo on the outside. Freezing and wet with the condensation of my cozy coffin hardly made the 8 ounces I shaved off my pack worth it. Everything I own must go inside, and once inside, it is free to swim about the interior, socks in faces, while warm coats were carried to the bottom by the currents where I couldn't reach them without some considerable effort. My mid-sleep situation slightly resembled a biology diagram from the 5th grade. Though I had spent some time to perfect my camp, bivvies still roused me early. Sloping campsites and ants conspired to thwart my sleeping-in plans. Still, I awoke, focused, probably adrenaline. Today was Mather Pass, the first serious summit and pass of the hike so far. The hike started at around 6,000 feet and climbed to about 12,000 feet in just a handful of miles. This sparked something in me. The height and the difficulty of whatever was next was a favorite topic of several experienced pedants who I had ran into who had hiked the trail before. But the more people told me the tales of how hard X or Y was going to be, the more my competitive nature made me more excited than anxious to see for myself. So I awoke in nautical twilight, that moment when you see the sky and realize it's morning even though it's still basically pitch dark. Dredging my clothes from the bottom of my bivy sack in the dark was a challenge, as was making an audit of all the items against the contrast of a dark forest floor in a 2,000-foot valley. I triple-checked my gear list, then I checked again, each time finding an errant sock or a propane tank that I had forgotten. I finally broke camp, proudly marching up the hill, directly placing my shin into a log, and oddly blurting out, "asshole," referring likely to myself and the log and probably the bivy too. I walked in blue light through a flat few miles, the outsides of my heels tearing against odd stitching in my boots. I stopped for coffee in the valley, staring at Mather in front of me, in the cool of the valley. Climbing Mather, I gasped for air as I focused on bagging the peak in under 2 hours. It seemed like the most reasonable, unreasonable goal I could come up with. The pass is no more or less than a series of endless switchbacks. Then a lake, a teaser respite before an even longer set of switchbacks. And somewhere before the lake, I thought I was nearly done. I saw a second peak peering above the one I was nearing, and I faded for just a moment. I remembered one of my trail friends, Dan, reading from his guidebook the night before, talking about the history of Mather Pass, the route and the beautiful red and purple flowers that peppered the talus formations for the first half of the trail, making it sound so benign as I had drifted off to sleep. Yet there I was, 10 hours later, gasping, panting, struggling, staring at flowers, looking at the red flowers Dan was actually talking about. I saw the peak slide out again behind an old Jeffrey pine. None of my group was behind me. I decided to set my expectations, which is important to do when spirits are flagging. Maybe I was almost done, but if not, could I go on? A few moments were all I needed. Where else could I go? And of course I could. And I was just tired is all, and because I hadn't slept in the asshole bivvy and that asshole log left a bruise, and the confluence of everything was ruining my hiking zen. So I took an opportunity to admit that I was probably just hungry and swallowed a massive peanut butter and jelly power bar that Jake had graciously given up the night before. I then spotted a vole on the rock above me and smiled. 3 or 4 carried twigs while weaving through the rocks higher up the hill. I moved on, dug in, and summited Mather around 8:30 a.m. I had no idea if that was 2 hours or not, but it felt good to be up there, done, and watching the view. I stared south across the Upper Basin Plateau, realizing the day had just started. 7 miles of spaghetti western high desert lay in front of me, yawning from below a steep decline down the steps on the other side of Mather. In the distance, the first rain clouds rolled in, around 14,000 feet, and I saw Split Mountain to the east. The day seemed different than the others as I skipped down the talus to keep the pressure off my tricky knee. I'd left something, and I wasn't sure what, but I know it was gone for sure. Part 2. In the Path of Electrical Storms. My fellow hikers would probably say I spent most days breaking camp early and hiking briskly, then stopping for hours to perch on some rock and make coffee and read. This afternoon, after summiting Mather and briskly heading down the hill, watching rain clouds behind me, I sat for a moment in the riverbanks where two rivers met. I'd only brought a few pages from a few authors. I was reading some pages I never had before, searching for something I didn't know how to find. My fingers were sunburned with dirty nails, my dry hands rubbed roughly on the paper. The river's confluence created rapids and welcome white noise as I turned the pages. I could not hear another thing. Earlier today, I'd followed one of these rivers from the north and above after crossing the Upper Basin. The Upper Basin was different than any terrain so far. This high desert just south of Mather Pass was a stark contrast to the morning climb. It was a welcome flatness, first of all, with even a slightly downward slope. Split Mountain followed me to my left for 2 hours as I inched downward. And I knew that at 14,000 feet, Split Mountain is just a little bit shorter than Whitney, and it wasn't so high above me now that I was regularly hiking above 10,000 feet, where the passenger airplanes sound twice as close and the clouds loom twice as big, where the sun sets for twice as long because it drops below the peaks well before it passes under the Earth's horizon, building these vast variegated stretches that grow darker from west to east. But this afternoon, the sky was increasingly cumulus covered. Colors were replaced by shades of slate and charcoal and black. Humid winds increasingly swept towards me at a sharp vector down and away from the direction of the storm. Dropping downward, dry grass was replaced by shrubs, then low trees, then thick woods as I followed the river to this confluence. Here it was, sheltered, and I decided to stop and wait for my fellow hikers. I opened my bag to pull out a book, some trail mix, the last of my oat bars which my wife Tosca had made for me over a month ago. I would read for quite a while I waited at the intersection of two rivers. And it wasn't lost on me, being at the intersection of two rivers, that I was also at a turning point in my hike. Where would I go from here? From here, it would take another good 4-5 days to get to the end of the trail, and yet another solid 3 or 4 days to get back to the last desolate outpost at Muir Ranch. I'd climbed the highest peaks thus far without too much trouble. I felt somewhat confident about being able to physically finish the rest of the trip, and mentally I'd already left behind certain demons. I'd abandoned technology. I'd been forced to embrace a much simpler way of moving through my days, and though I was arriving at what I was seeking and what I had wanted, my heart still scrabbled up the trail. Over several hours, the thunder kept rolling in, black clouds to the south. My friends not yet arrived from the north. Pellets of rain came and went as I watched various groups of hikers pick out nice spots in the campgrounds around me. As I read, I was increasingly aware of the sounds of unbuckling, letting packs thud to the dirt, striking propane fires, ripstop nylon unfurling, zipping and chuckling and unzipping, and eating soup in warm hoodies and long johns. I was alone, and I was waiting for something. I was watching clouds roll in and waiting. Then I read this one passage. Discontent is the want of self-reliance. It is infirmity of will. We sit down and cry for company instead of imparting to them truth and health in rough electric shocks, putting them once more in communication with their own reason. The secret of fortune is joy in our own hands. Welcome evermore to gods and men is the self-helping person. For them, all doors are flung wide. This was Self-Reliance by Ralph Waldo Emerson. I stared back into the black above the mountains. This is where my path led me, and yet somehow I was reluctant to go. I don't know why. I was reluctant to get struck by lightning. I was reluctant to get farther away from the comfortable campsites, from my fellow companions, and the warm sense of togetherness that had seemed to make the trip bearable up until now. I was reluctant to be alone, to go at it alone. I didn't know why I had flown 3,000 miles from Austin, drove 300 miles from San Francisco, and hiked another 200 just to come out here and be by myself. But for all of those reluctances, I was more afraid of waiting at a confluence of two rivers, waiting for someone else to show up, discontent, waiting for somebody else for the rest of my life. I had to help myself. I couldn't finish this hike without finding that path. Truth and health in rough electric shocks were waiting for me somewhere up above. So without trying to think about it too much, I tucked my map into the side pocket of my pack, laced my shoes, and took one more long stare north. The moment I started hiking south, the trail moved steeply back uphill. The rain started falling, and the wind poured over the mountain in advance of the darkest storm front I've ever seen. Every step I took made the idea to head out alone seem worse and worse. I climbed the 3/4-mile hill in about 15 minutes, arriving at a plateau of green grass, giving stark contrast to the dark gray sky. The beautiful alpine lake, Lake Marjorie, was a 1/4 mile across this stretch. I was completely drenched, and I ran across as fast as one can with a 20-pound pack bouncing awkwardly, the weight shifting out of rhythm to my stride. As lightning began to strike some ways off, I arrived at a strand of trees and yellow grasses on the banks of the lake, a green and soft lake just in the shadow of Mount Pincho. I found a semicircled spot beneath some gnarled pines that created a bit of a windbreak. I dropped my bag, I stared at the storm, then I glared at it. And I'm not sure why I did it, but I stood there in my wet clothes and I glared at the storm as it roared at me beyond blue flashes of light covered in the peaks beyond Pincho. There was nothing out there but beautiful. And I had chose this. I watched as the clouds above me split apart as if pulled on a seam. The clouds curved around the spot where I stood. I saw hail and rain falling to my left and right, maybe 200 yards away, yet above me was a clear blue sky and a few misty white clouds. Thunder followed the lightning by about 3 seconds. Technically, the storm was more or less right overhead, but at the center of the storm, a beam of sunlight shone through, drying my spot on the earth. I had a moment of relief to get set, too close to run away. I was content that the trees would be good enough protection. I couldn't have timed it any better or worse. fortune, and joy. I threw open my trusted bivy sack and tossed all my belongings inside. I pulled on my warm pants, my gloves. I started the stove. My legs stayed inside the warmth of my sleeping bag. I quickly cooked the last of my Knorr soup. I don't even know where I got that. I gave it 2 minutes to boil and cook, ate it quite al dente, and finished the rest of my water. The sky above me was sewn up again, and I quickly tidied up the rest of my belongings and placed them in the bivvy. Hail came first, then rain as I sealed myself inside. I was not invincible. I was simply here by choice, with my pack beneath my legs and my supplies to the windward side. Hail pummeling the nylon just inches from my head. Blue light and thunder roaring me to sleep. I was alone with my choices and extremely located for the first time, perhaps ever, certainly in a long while. And this is exactly what I was looking for. I was content, and so drifted off for the first good night's sleep on the trail so far. I hope you've enjoyed this journal entry. If you'd like to hear more in the continuation of this story, please let me know either in the comments or through email. I'd love to know if this is resonating with you. If you like what you've been hearing, don't forget to subscribe to this podcast. And finally, I would ask that you share this with just one person who you think might find this episode worthwhile. Support for Rebel Nature comes from an affiliate partnership with Blick Art Supplies. Rebel Nature is managed and produced by Quail Run Studios. Original music written and recorded by me. Any commercial music that may have been used in this episode has been licensed for airplay by the Harry Fox Agency, 40 Wall Street, New York, New York. You can learn more about me and my art at ChristopherGrantWard.com.